Hey guys, for today's video, I'll be analyzing the Phase 1 and 2 Luna 1 banners that recently got revealed to determine the pull value of these characters and weapons. Starting off with the first phase, we've got Lauma with Nahida, two Dendro supports that will be the best in slot options for a ton of Dendro reaction based teams, with Barbara, Kuki, and Kave as the 4-star. When it comes to Lauma's pros, she's gonna be the best Bloom reaction support in the game. She's able to make Bloom reactions crit when she's the only not-cry character on the team and provides a ton of damage boosts to Bloom reactions. Not only that, but she also shreds both Dendro and Hydro resistances by 25%, which will be incredibly powerful in Bloom reaction based teams with a Dendro flex slot or a Hydro flex slot like Alhaitham or Nubilet. She's also most definitely going to be a dedicated Lunar Bloom support for Nefer, who is theorized to be the dedicated DPS to Lunar Bloom in the same sense that Flins is the dedicated DPS to Lunar Charge. This is because Lamas' passive provides crit stats for Lunar Bloom damage instead of regular Bloom reactions when there is another not-cry character like Nefer on the team. Now for this next pro, it is a bit of an oddball since it doesn't relate to the meta, but it's arguably even better because it provides something that very few characters do, and that's exploration. For Lamas' charge attack, Lauma will transform into an envoy and be able to jump into the air and walk over water, while also traversing much more distance than even most exploration characters. Anyways, with her charge attack out of the way, for her synergies, she's gonna work with pretty much any Dendro, Hydro, Pyro, or Electro character to some extent, but her noticeable synergies will be Nailu, Nubilet, Nahida, and Xingqiu. Nailu is going to be a great synergy for Lauma since Lauma is going to be Nailu's best support. Nubilet is also going to be a great synergy with Lauma since Nubilet's powerful DPS is going to be incredibly powerful even compared to the Bloom buffs that Nailu provides in Bloom Team. Nahida is also going to be a great synergy because Nahida is going to be the best Dendro flex slot in practically every Bloom team that Lauma is going to be in. Xingqiu is also going to be an amazing synergy because his Hydro application is far better than Yelan or Furina's damage bonuses for Bloom reaction based team. Also, he's going to be far better than Aino since Aino raises the moon sign level, which is going to be a big no-no for Lauma since it'll get rid of the buffs that allow Bloom reactions to crit and instead replace them with the buffs that'll allow Lunar Bloom damage to crit, which as of right now can only be done through Lauma's hold skill, which doesn't do anywhere near as much damage as the team's Bloom reaction. Now for Nahida, Nahida is going to be the best Dendro flex slot in the game since she has insane Dendro application, Dendro sub DPS, and elemental mastery buffs that are far better than any of Baishu's healing, Dendro buffs, or Dendro application. She works in practically any Dendro reaction based team, unlike Lauma who only works in every Bloom reaction based team, meaning that Nahida is going to be far better than Lauma in aggravate, spread, and burning team. For some noticeable synergies, well, the same characters that Lauma synergizes with will also perfectly synergize with Nahida, but she'll also be good with Alhaitham and Sino. This is because Alhaitham is practically built for spread team, which again Nahida is the best in, and Sino is built for aggravates, which again Nahida is also the best in. Now, as you may have already noticed, Nahida's exclusive synergies, at least relative to Lauma, aren't even that luxurious, since Alhaitham isn't even that great anymore, and Sino is the definition of mid. So why would these synergies even matter? Well, they kinda don't, since even though Verisa, a top 5 DPS, can benefit more off of Nahida than Lauma in an aggravate team, chances are Verisa will also become old news once Columbina drops, in where she'll buff Lauma and does Bloom reaction based teams, to the point where Bloom reaction based teams will just be too good to pass on, in which case Nahida's exclusive spread and aggravate abilities will pale in comparison to Lauma's Bloom reaction expertise, which is why I believe that you should summon on Lauma instead of Nahida, since even though Nahida will still be the best Dendro flex slot in Bloom reaction based teams, Lauma is still a far more important component of Bloom reaction based team that again will become even better than spread and aggravate teams when Columbina drops. For the 4 stars, we have Kuki Shinobu, who's a viable character for Hyper Bloom, Kave, who's a decent Bloom DPS, and Barbara, who's a decent Hydro applicator and healer. Out of the 3 of them, really only Kuki is viable since she's still pretty good for Hyper Bloom, while Kave sucks in comparison to a Bloom DPS like Nailu, and Barbara sucks in comparison to Xingqiu. For the weapon banner, Lauma's signature will be insane for any Catalyst character that relies heavily on elemental mastery like Moalani, Miski, Silali, or even Nahida herself, since it provides a ton of elemental mastery, 324 elemental mastery to be exact. It'll also be an even better pick than Nahida's signature if you're gonna run Nahida in a Bloom reaction based team, since it buffs Bloom reaction damage by a significant amount. Now for Nahida's signature, this signature will also be extremely good for any character that relies on elemental mastery, since it provides 264 elemental mastery as its main stats, and an additional 32 elements mastery for every character that is of the same elements as the wearer. It also increases the wearer's damage bonus from their elemental type by 10% for every ally that isn't of their same type, which is a decent damage bonus for any catalyst DPS or sub DPS. For the second phase, we've got Flins, the new dedicated lunar charge main DPS, and Yelan, a decent hydro applicator and powerful hydro sub DPS. Flins is going to be the first main DPS that heavily relies on lunar charge, to the point where he'll practically have Inazuma levels of DPS without Inefa, since Inefa provides so much lunar charge sub DPS and lunar charge buffs. Not only that, but Inefa also fulfills Flins' moon sign passive, which he heavily depends on, because unless his moon sign is of the Ascendant Gleam level, aka unless you have another Notcry unit on the same team as Flins, his damage also drops significantly. Thus, with Inefa, his damage is around Natlane characters' level of DPS, but without Inefa, his damage is around Inazuma, Sumeru, or Fontaine levels of DPS. Also, the damage increase from his C1 is similar to that of Flins, so if you don't have Flins, or you're just not planning to get her, your other option is to just get him to C1. Now, similarly to how Columbina will definitely buff Lauma to the point where she'll be hands down far better than Nahida meta-wise, the same thing will probably happen with Flins, meaning that if you don't have Inefa, you'll probably be able to replace Inefa with Columbina and reach Natlane characters level of DPS. And if you do have Inefa, you'll probably be able to reach Skirk levels of DPS with Columbina. Thus, summoning on Flins is heavily dependent on whether you want to invest into the Notcry meta and on whether or not you can get him to C1, since again, you could replace Inefa with the C1 and all of this would remain true. Also, considering that he's only viable in lunar charge teams, I would highly recommend staying away from his banner if you don't enjoy characters with restrictive kits. He's also your typical normal attack spamming character, so if you don't enjoy this type of repetitive playstyle either, well then I'd also recommend skipping him. Now, if you don't mind all of these aspects of his gameplay and investments, well then sure, I'd say summon on him if you like him, or if you simply want to invest into the meta, since, again, chances are, he'll probably reach huge levels of DPS in future patches. Anyways, for his synergies, he'll typically need one off-field Electro Applicator and one off-field Hydro Applicator, along with a Resistance Shredder or Attack Booster. For example, for his premium team, he'll want Inefa for the reasons I've stated, Sucrose because she shreds Electro Resistances and provides EM, and C6 Aino because she has pretty good Hydro Application and can provide a 35% damage boost to lunar charge damage. For Yelan, she's one of the few go-to Hydro Applicators and Hydro sub DPS, and is an amazing option in Charge Reaction, Bloom Reaction, Freeze, and Vape teams. Thing is, even though her sub DPS is typically better than Qingzhuo, when it comes to Hydro Application, Qingzhuo is definitely better, and even though she does provide a damage boost that averages out to a 20% damage boost, in Bloom and Charge Reaction teams, this damage boost is pretty mediocre, since it doesn't amplify the team's damage that much, and in comparison to Furina, Yelan is even worse, since her Hydro Application comes from coordinated attacks with normal attacks, meaning that she doesn't synergize with characters who do the majority of their DPS through their skills, ultimates, plunging attacks, or charge attacks. Because of this, even though Yelan is pretty good, I would honestly only recommend summoning on her if you need another Hydro Applicator and sub DPS for endgame modes like Stygian Onslaught and Imaginarium Theater, since Furina can provide Hydro Application that isn't dependent on normal attacks and a 75% damage bonus with a good healer, and Qingzhuo's Hydro Application is better, not to mention he also provides interruption resistance that synergizes really well with normal attack dependent DPS. Anyways, for Yelan's synergies, she'll synergize with a ton of different characters who want Hydro Application and rely on their normal attacks for damage. Thus, characters like Skirk, who wants a team composed exclusively of Hydro and Cryo units and does normal attacks, Futao, who wants as much Hydro Application as possible for her Pyro infused attacks, or Raiden, who wants a ton of Hydro Application for her Hyper Bloom teams, would all be good with her. Now for the question of whether you should go for Flins or Yelan, well, Yelan is usable in a multitude of teams, but she also has two really good replacements, one of them being a universally owned character pretty much since she's so powerful and popular, and another being a 4-star, aka universally owned as well. And Flins, well, he's really only good with the C1, Inefa, or Columbina, who hasn't even come out yet, and he's only good for one specific team, but his DPS will definitely reach meta levels once Columbina comes out, so if you want a really cool and powerful, yet restrictive and dependent character, well then go for Flins. But if you want another alternative to an already highly desired archetype, go for Yelan. For the 4 stars, we've got the new 4-star Aino, who has decent Hydro Application and who will be Flins' best in slot Hydro Applicator at C6 because of the 35% damage boost she provides to the Lunar Charge reaction. We also got Dori, who is a bad electro applicator, healer, battery, and a horrible 4-star unit who is definitely worse than the other options on this banner. We've also got Sucrose, who is part of Flins' premium teams because she can provide a ton of EM without negatively affecting the Lunar Charge reaction like Nahida. Not only that, but she can also shred through resistances. Now if you're going for C2 Flins, Sucrose loses a ton of value since Flins' C2 replaces her resistance shred. Thus, she would typically be replaced with someone like Bennett because Bennett provides a lot of attack, which Flins typically just wants more than EM. For the weapon banner, Flins' weapon is going to be really powerful because it increases his personal Lunar Charge damage and provides him with 72% crit stats and a bit of energy, which results in around a 31% damage increase for Flins. But for other characters, it'll really only be used as a decent crit rate stat stick. For Yelan's weapon, it'll give her a ton of crit damage and max HP, along with some decent damage boosts. But similarly to Flins' weapon, Yelan's weapon will only be good as a crit damage main stat weapon that also provides some decent damage boosts for other bow units. For the Chronicled Banner, Tenari and Dea are obviously skips, since you can just get them from losing your 50-50. But if you can't wait any longer, or if you want constellations, Tenari is honestly a pretty viable spread DPS that is filled with decent constellations, and Dea is a pretty good pyro applicator for teams that don't mind her slow pyro application, like Virgin or Burn Vape teams. She can also be ran as a viable DPS, but only at C6. For Sino, he's an on-field electro DPS that is decent in overload teams, quick bloom, charge, and aggravate teams, and he's pretty difficult to build since he wants a perfect balance of energy recharge, crit stats, attack stats, and elemental mastery stats, which typically isn't worth the effort because his damage is around the same as Raiden's, aka a character that is years old. For Nailu, prior to Notcry, Nailu would have been a pretty bad pick since her single target damage is horrendous, considering that she's a dedicated bloom DPS. But with the release of Lauma, Nailu will actually be a pretty decent pick since Lauma will buff Nailu's bloom damage to the point where she'll be hitting numbers on par with those of Fontaine units in single target scenarios, and she'll be hitting numbers on par with Natlin units in 2 target scenarios, which is definitely a massive difference that should be considered if you're deciding to pull on her, since you'll typically only be hitting numbers on par with Fontaine units, considering that in most contexts, you're only fighting one big boss, which sucks considering that pretty soon Nefer is going to come out and just mog her completely. For Wanderer, well, in comparison to his other Anemo DPS, like Chaska, who's an Adlin DPS, and Shao, who got really good buffs from Shanyun and the new plunging sets, his DPS is pretty subpar. Still, relative to most DPS characters, Wanderer's DPS is still pretty viable. For Alhaitham, he's really only good in spread and hyperbloom teams, and his DPS is only good as Fontaine units, meaning that he's no longer considered as a part of the top 3 main DPS in the game, since nowadays his damage is around 50% of the top 3 main DPS in the game. For the Chronicled Weapon Banner, Tenari and Dea won't have any weapons because they're standard characters, but Sinos' weapon is going to be an insane pick for a lot of polearm characters. This is because his weapon provides a ton of crit rates and a ton of attack that's based off of your EM, meaning that polearm characters that wants EM, crit, and attack, like Hutao, who wants some EM to vapor melt, Arlecchino, who also wants some EM to vapor melt, or Inafa and Flins, who wants as much attack as possible while also wanting a ton of EM and crits, will benefit off of this polearm. And obviously, this weapon will also be Sinos' best in slot. For Nailu's signature, it's really only good for her, Ayato, and Furina, since they're all sword users who want as much max HP as possible, which this weapon provides a ton of. For Wanderer's signature, this weapon will really only be good with Wanderer and Risley, since the attack speed it provides only benefits normal attack DPS. It'll also be decent as a crit damage main stat weapon that has a larger base attack stats than 4-star weapons. For Alhaitham's weapon, this weapon is going to be a really good choice for a lot of sword users, since it provides a ton of crit stats, and it increases the normal attack and skill damage of characters by a ton. So, characters like Kaching, Ayato, Clorinde, and Skirt will benefit heavily from this weapon. So, in conclusion, for the first phase, go for Lauma instead of Nahida, since spread and aggravate teams, aka her exclusive expertise, aren't even that good compared to the bloom reaction based teams that Lauma and Colombina will buff during the Notcry patches. For the 4 stars, Cookie will be a decent pull, but Kave and Barbara are pretty bad. For the weapons, Lauma's and Nahida's signature will be really good. good with Catalyst units that require EM, and Lauma's weapon will be incredibly good with Catalyst characters that can be used in Bloom reaction based teams, and Nahida's weapon will be decent with Catalyst characters that benefits from damage bonuses along with that EM. For the second phase, Flins will be a really good DPS pick if you don't mind his meta viability being tied behind either Inefa, his C1, and or Colombina, and if you don't mind his restrictive kits. Yelan will also be a good choice if you lack another Hydro offfielder for game modes like Stygian Onslaughts and Imaginarium Theater. For the 4 stars, Aino will be decent, with their C6 being really good for Flins until Colombina drops. Sucrose will be really good too, especially with Flins, since as of right now, she's a best in slot support with a Flins that is less than C2, and Dory will be a shaft pick unless you have no other good units, in which case she'll act as a decent Electro applicator. For the weapons, both Flins and Yelan's weapons would be really good with both of them respectively, but only serve as decent crit main stat weapons for polearm and bow characters respectively. For the Chronicled Banner, really only Alhaitham and Nailu will be decent picks, with Wanderer and Sino being subpar and Tenari and Deya being really bad picks. For the weapon banner, Alhaitham's weapon will be the best since it can be utilized by a vast amount of characters, with Sinos' weapon being really good as well, especially for recent units like Inefa and Flins. Nailu's weapon will also be really good with Furina and Ayato, and Wanderer's weapon will be really good with Risley, but will only serve as a decent crit main stat 5-star weapon for other units. Anyways, that's all I've got for today. If you've enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. If you have anything to say, feel free to leave it down in the comments below. I would greatly appreciate it. Goodbye.